A sophisticated global network of empires vanished in a historical blink. Historian Eric H. Klein called the end of the Bronze Age the worst disaster in ancient history. This video will reveal the true story of that cataclysm, a perfect storm of invasion, climate chaos, and system failure that shattered a world. You will understand how a single generation witnessed the fall of civilizations and the birth of a new age. What mysterious confederation of sea raiders brought kings to their knees? What hidden climate data points to a drought that starved entire nations? By the end, you will see the fragile threads that hold any society together. What does the collapse of a world teach us about our own? The stage for this collapse was a world of astonishing sophistication. Think of the Hittite Empire, a land of rugged Anatolian highlands, as the ancient equivalent of a military-industrial complex. They commanded the most vital resource of the age, the very ingredient for weapons and tools, bronze. Their control over rich tin and copper mines gave them immense power. Far to the west, the citadels of Mycenaean Greece stood proud, their massive stone walls, the famous Lion Gate, guarding palaces filled with gold and artisans. This was not a world of isolated villages. It was a globalized economy. Egyptian pharaohs, ruling from the unparalleled wealth of the Nile, received diplomatic letters from Hittite kings addressed as "my brother." These messages, carefully inscribed on clay tablets, crossed the Mediterranean, negotiating marriages, trading gifts, and forming alliances. The bustling port city of Ugarit in the Levant was a hub of commerce, its merchants dealing in everything from Cypriot copper to fine Aegean pottery. This was the Great Powers Club, a fragile equilibrium of empires that maintained a tense but functional peace. For a time, it worked, yet this glittering international system had a critical weakness. Its stability depended entirely on a delicate balance, a web of trade and diplomacy that was about to be torn apart. The first cracks in this glittering world appeared on the horizon, not as a storm cloud, but as a fleet of strange, swift ships. For a coastal merchant in the late Bronze Age, the sight of these vessels would have been the stuff of nightmares. They were the Sea Peoples, and their arrival heralded a wave of pure chaos. The most vivid testimony to their terror comes from the walls of an Egyptian temple at Medinet Habu. Here, Pharaoh Ramesses III had his victory over them immortalized in stunning, brutal detail. The reliefs show a chaotic naval battle, with Egyptian forces fighting fiercely against warriors who look utterly foreign, with feathered headdresses and distinctive round shields. But who were these mysterious attackers? They were not a single, uniform army. Instead, they were a confederation of different groups, a coalition of the desperate and the warlike. Historians believe they included tribes with names like the Peliset, who would later settle on the coast of Canaan and become the famous Philistines of the Bible. Their precise origins are one of history's great puzzles. Were they displaced peoples from the fractured Mycenaean world of Greece? Were they from the western coasts of Anatolia, or even from the islands of the Mediterranean? The debate continues to this day. Their assault was relentless and widespread. They did not just challenge Egypt, they raided the vulnerable coasts of the Hittite Empire and smashed into the trading cities of the Levant like Ugarit. One desperate letter found in the ruins of Ugarit captures the panic perfectly. It reads, quote, "The enemy ships are already here. They have set fire to my towns and have done very great damage in the country," unquote. This was more than a military invasion. It was a systemic shock. These raiders severed the vital maritime trade routes that were the lifeblood of the Bronze Age empires. They sacked ports, disrupted the flow of copper, tin, and luxury goods, and created a climate of fear that paralyzed commerce and diplomacy. The old powers, used to fighting organized armies in set-piece battles, were completely unprepared for this kind of unpredictable maritime guerrilla warfare. The Sea Peoples were a hurricane of steel and fire, a force the established order simply could not contain, and as their ships ravaged the coastline, a second, even more insidious threat was growing from within. While the Sea Peoples raided from the sea, the foundations of the Bronze Age world were crumbling from within. This was not a collapse caused by a single enemy, but a catastrophic failure of the entire system. The great kingdoms of the late Bronze Age were not isolated fortresses. They were deeply interdependent, locked in an economic embrace. The fall of one could, and did, trigger a domino effect that toppled them all. The intricate trade networks that supplied vital resources began to snap. Tin from distant Afghanistan, essential for making bronze, could no longer reach the smiths of Anatolia. Copper from Cyprus sat in its ports, its ships unable to sail through pirate-infested waters. The luxurious goods that oiled the wheels of diplomacy and affirmed elite status simply stopped flowing. This economic breakdown had an immediate and terrifying human cost. We can almost hear the desperation in that final letter from a merchant in the burning city of Ugarit, a plea for help that was sent out but never answered. His world was ending, not just with a bang, but with a deafening silence from former allies who were too besieged to respond. At the heart of this collapse were the centralized palace economies. These were the command centers of the Bronze Age world, vast bureaucratic machines that controlled everything from grain harvests to the production of textiles and weapons. In good times, this system was remarkably efficient, organizing labor and distributing goods, but when shockwaves hit, it became a profound liability. With trade routes severed and harvests failing, the palace could no longer collect, manage, or redistribute resources. The intricate clay tablet records, once a symbol of power, became meaningless. Specialized craftspeople, who for generations had perfected the art of metalworking or fresco painting, found themselves without patrons or materials. Their skills, the pinnacle of Bronze Age culture, were lost within a single generation. This led to widespread food shortages, rampant inflation, and a swift descent into a subsistence economy. The very interconnectedness that had been the source of their strength, their globalized network, became their fatal vulnerability. A local crisis was no longer contained. It was amplified, ricocheting across the continent and escalating into a perfect storm. And as if the violence of man and the failure of his systems were not enough, a third, even more powerful actor was entering the stage, one that would push these teetering civilizations over the edge. While empires grappled with invaders and economic collapse, the very earth beneath their feet began to betray them. Scientific evidence has uncovered a relentless, invisible enemy, a climatic shift of staggering proportions. Paleoclimatologists, the detectives of ancient weather, have pieced together this story from unlikely sources. They analyze mineral deposits in deep caves, known as speleothems, which form layer by layer over centuries, preserving a chemical record of rainfall. They pull up long cores of mud from the bottom of the eastern Mediterranean, examining the sediment for pollen and isotopes that reveal past aridity. The data from these natural archives is unequivocal. Around the year 1200 BCE, the entire region was gripped by a mega-drought, a catastrophe that lasted for generations. Imagine the slow, creeping death of a landscape. Springs that had bubbled for centuries dry up. Riverbeds, once the arteries of civilization, become wide, dusty scars across the land. Harvests do not just fail one bad year, they wither again and again until the grain stores of mighty kingdoms are hollowed out. This was not a single season of hardship, it was a permanent, punishing change in the world's climate. For the Hittite Empire, this drought was a death sentence. Their power was built on the fertile plains of Anatolia, a breadbasket that fed their armies and their people. As the rains vanished, that agricultural surplus vanished with them. A tablet from the Hittite capital of Hattusa contains a desperate plea from a royal official, stating, quote, "There is a severe famine in your land. All of my subjects are dying," unquote. This was the climate catastrophe in human terms, mass starvation, and the inevitable social chaos that follows. The Mega-Drought acted as a brutal stress multiplier. It turned political rivalries into existential fights for the last sources of water and food. It transformed economic hardship into outright famine, pushing populations to the brink. When people are starving, loyalty to a distant king or a crumbling palace becomes a meaningless concept. This environmental pressure created a vast pool of desperate, displaced people, ready to join roving bands of raiders or rise up in rebellion against their own rulers. The Sea Peoples themselves may not have been a cause of the collapse, but a symptom of it. Entire populations set adrift by a changing climate, forced to become invaders simply to survive. The perfect storm was now complete, a shattering military onslaught, a catastrophic failure of the globalized economy, and a climate system that withdrew its life support. So what happened when these three forces converged on the glittering capitals of the Bronze Age? The final act of this ancient drama was one of fire and silence. The final, fatal blow came not from foreign armies or failing rains, but from within the very cities and palaces that defined this world. As central authority crumbled under the weight of famine and invasion, the social contract that bound society together simply snapped. Texts from this chaotic period speak ominously of dependents rising up against their overlords. The term is bureaucratic and dry, but the reality it describes was pure fire and chaos. Picture a once great palace, its storerooms now echoing and empty. The king's soldiers are far away, trying to hold back an unstoppable tide of sea peoples. And in the streets, a populace that has endured one too many hungry winters finally turns its rage on the gates of the elite. This was not just rebellion, it was a complete unraveling of the established order. The ruling class had justified its power through a divine mandate to provide security and manage abundance. When the grain ships stopped arriving and the granaries were bare, that mandate became a hollow lie. Why should a farmer starve while a distant king who could no longer protect him still lived in luxury? The archaeological record screams this story. At site after site, the destruction layers tell a tale of two-stage collapse. There is evidence of external assault, yes, with broken weapons and siege works. But mixed with that is the clear signature of internal violence, fires set from within the city walls, palaces looted of their treasures by their own inhabitants. The great citadels were not just toppled by outside forces, they were gutted from the inside out. Local warlords and ambitious chieftains seized the moment, carving out their own petty kingdoms from the carcass of the old empires. This internal strife was the true end. A society can survive an enemy at its gates, but it cannot survive when its own people have lost all faith. The palace gates were stormed, the bureaucrats were chased out, and with them vanished the knowledge, the art, and the complex system they had built over centuries. The Bronze Age did not end with a single event, but with a cascade of failures that left a world in ruins, waiting for something new to rise from the ashes. The ground itself began to revolt, as if the invasions, the failing trade, and the punishing drought were not enough. A new terror shook the very foundations of the great cities. The archaeological evidence is stark and violent. At Mycenae, the mighty citadel of legendary kings, we find colossal stone walls toppled inward, as if crushed by a giant, invisible fist. In the streets of Hattusa, the Hittite capital, skeletons lie crushed beneath fallen masonry, a final, silent testament to a cataclysm that struck without warning. These are not the marks of human warfare alone. They are the fingerprints of earthquakes, powerful enough to bring down civilizations that had stood for centuries. This was not an isolated tremor. Historians and geologists now speak of an earthquake storm, a period of intense and widespread tectonic upheaval that rippled across the entire eastern Mediterranean world. Imagine the sheer, gut-wrenching terror of it. The world, already unstable, begins to shudder and roar. Homes and palaces, symbols of permanence and power, are reduced to rubble in minutes. Fires sparked from overturned hearths and oil lamps would have raced through the wreckage, consuming what the tremors did not destroy. For the survivors, the psychological blow was as devastating as the physical one. Their gods, it seemed, had abandoned them utterly. The very earth, the most solid and dependable element of their existence, had betrayed them. These natural disasters delivered a crippling, final blow to societies already on the brink. A kingdom struggling to feed its people could not also muster the resources to rebuild its shattered cities. An army demoralized by famine and internal strife would find its spirit broken when its fortress walls lay in ruins. The earthquakes did not cause the collapse in a vacuum, but they acted as a brutal coup de grace. They demolished the last remaining bastions of central authority, disrupted any hope of agricultural recovery, and left populations scattered, traumatized, and utterly vulnerable. It was in this smoldering landscape of broken stones and broken spirits that the final, decisive human attacks found their easiest targets. The stage was now set for the final curtain to fall on an entire age. The ground still holds the memory of that final, fiery hour. Walk across the excavated ruins of Ugarit, and your feet will pass over a distinct, dark line in the soil, a stratum of pure catastrophe. Archaeologists call this a destruction horizon, a single layer of ash, charcoal, and shattered debris that seals the vibrant late Bronze Age world beneath it. This is not just dirt, it is a timeline of apocalypse written in burned mud brick and melted glass. In this stark layer, the story becomes terrifyingly tangible. You find storage jars crushed mid-collapse, their contents of grain long since carbonized. You find spear points bent and discarded. And sometimes, heartbreakingly, you find the bones of the people caught in the inferno, a silent, skeletal witness to the violence that consumed their city. This is the physical proof of the end, yet the story becomes even more haunting at places like Hattusa, the mighty Hittite capital. Here, the evidence is not just of fire, but of a profound and deliberate silence. After the city was torched, its massive gates were left broken, its towering temples were left as rubble. No one came to rebuild. No new king raised his palace upon the old foundations. The site was simply abandoned to the wind and the weeds for centuries. This tells us something crucial. The collapse was not a simple reset button. It was a clean, brutal break. The intricate knowledge of the Hittite scribes, the architectural secrets of their engineers, the very memory of their empire, was effectively erased from the earth. A darkness fell, not just of smoke and ash, but of forgetting. The vibrant, interconnected world of international diplomacy and trade was shattered into 1,000 isolated pieces. From this scorched earth, however, a new world would have to slowly, painfully begin to grow. The final words of the Bronze Age were not carved in stone for posterity, but scratched onto damp clay in a moment of sheer desperation. These last clay tablets, pulled from the ashes of burned palaces, are the closest we can get to hearing the voices of that dying world. They are not grand historical narratives. They are the raw, unfiltered pleas of people watching everything they knew crumble into chaos. The most haunting of these messages come from the port city of Ugarit. One letter, written by a king to his ally, cries out, "My father, behold, the enemy ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." The terror in these words is palpable even today, but the true tragedy lies not just in the message but in its fate. Archaeologists found this desperate plea for help still sitting in its kiln, hardened by the very fire that consumed the city. It was a letter that was never sent, a cry for aid that never reached its destination because no one was left to send it, and likely no one was left to receive it. The entire system of mutual defense, the Brotherhood of Kings, had already collapsed into silence. On the other side of the conflict, the victors told their own story. In Egypt, the Great Karnak inscription boasts of Pharaoh Ramesses III defeating the Sea Peoples in a great battle. But even in this propaganda of triumph, the scale of the threat is undeniable. The inscription describes the confederation as a single, united force from the ends of the earth, a testament to how overwhelming and unprecedented this invasion appeared to the most powerful empire of the age. These fragmented texts from both the doomed and the survivors form a heartbreaking dialogue of collapse. They capture the panic of a ruler who sees his cities burning and the grim determination of another fighting for his very survival. They remind us that this was not an abstract historical event. It was a human catastrophe experienced by individuals who felt the same confusion and fear that anyone would when their world disintegrates. These clay tablets are their final testimony, the last whispers of a civilization on the brink of silence. Of all the great powers that vanished, the silence of the Hittites is the most profound. This was not a minor kingdom fading away. It was a superpower, a military and industrial giant that stood toe to toe with Egypt itself. Yet its disappearance was so absolute, so complete, it was as if the entire empire had been swallowed by the earth. Their capital, Hattusa, a city of massive stone walls and grand temples, was simply abandoned. No new city rose from its foundations. No local legends even remembered its name. For over 3,000 years, the Hittites were a ghost, a civilization erased from human memory. So where did they go? The answer is not a single destination, but a diaspora, a great scattering of a people. Some migrated southeast, carving out small, struggling kingdoms in the hills of Syria and southern Anatolia. These Neo-Hittite states held on for a few centuries, their rulers still using the Hittite hieroglyphic script for their monuments, a faint and fading echo of their former glory. But they were shadows of the empire that had once been. Other Hittites likely remained in their Anatolian homeland, only to be absorbed by new waves of people like the Phrygians, who moved into the political vacuum. Their identity, their language, and their stories slowly blended into those of the newcomers, lost to time. The true tragedy lies in the totality of the loss. The Hittite language, a complex tongue preserved on thousands of clay tablets, fell silent. The very knowledge of how to read it vanished for millennia until modern archaeologists painstakingly deciphered it. The collapse of their central Anatolian heartland was so catastrophic, a perfect storm of the Mega-Drought that starved them, the invasions that shattered their defenses, and the internal rebellions that tore their society apart, that it obliterated them not just as a political entity, but as a cultural memory. The silence from Hattusa is not merely empty, it is a historical void, a ghostly echo that asks us how an entire world can simply be forgotten. Their great fortresses were built to be impregnable. The Mycenaean Greeks, a society of legendary warriors, inhabited palace citadels that were marvels of Bronze Age engineering. Places like Mycenae and Tiryns were protected by walls of such massive, rough-hewn stone that later generations believed only the mythical Cyclopes could have lifted them. These were not just royal homes, they were fortified command centers designed to withstand any assault. Yet around the year 1200 BCE, they fell. The archaeological evidence is stark, a clear layer of ash and burned debris testifying to a violent end. The very fires that consumed these palaces, however, accidentally preserved a final, desperate glimpse into their last days. At Pylos, clay tablets inscribed with the Linear B script were baked hard in the inferno, turning them from fragile records into permanent artifacts. These were not epic poems, they were administrative documents, the mundane paperwork of a state on the brink. They speak of last-minute, urgent preparations, detailing the deployment of watchers to the coast. It was a final, futile attempt to organize a defense against an unseen threat, very likely the same sea peoples who were ravaging the coasts of Egypt and the Levant. The defenses failed. In the aftermath, a profound silence descended. The great citadel of Mycenae was not rebuilt to its former glory. Its population dwindled to a tiny fraction, a small, poor community living among the ruins of a civilization they could no longer comprehend. The complex bureaucracy that managed everything from bronze production to the distribution of olive oil vanished overnight, and with the collapse of the palace system, the knowledge of writing itself was lost. For centuries, Greece was plunged into an illiterate era, a simpler, darker time where the memory of the Age of Heroes lived on only in fragmented oral tales, the echoes of a world consumed by fire. Amid the smoking ruins of empires, one civilization managed to hold the line. Egypt stood as the last bastion against the tide of chaos, but its survival came at a price that would reshape its soul. The pharaoh who faced this ultimate test was Ramesses III. He understood that the confederation of sea peoples was a threat unlike any other, a migratory storm of warriors and their families seeking not just plunder but a new home. He prepared for a war on two fronts, marshalling his armies for a great land battle at the borders of Egypt and assembling a fleet to meet the invaders at sea. The walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu tell the story of this desperate struggle. In one stunning relief, we see the naval battle, a chaotic melee of ships locked together. Egyptian archers rain arrows down from their high decks onto the enemy vessels, while the sea peoples, with their distinctive feathered headdresses, fight back from boats powered by both sail and oar. It is a scene of controlled, organized military power clashing with a ferocious, mobile foe. The inscriptions boast of the enemy being dragged, netted, and thrown into the water like so many fish. Egypt claimed a great victory, and in a military sense it was true. The invasion was repelled. The heartland of the Nile was saved from the sack that had consumed Hattusa and Mycenae. But this salvation was not a return to glory. It was a Pyrrhic victory that bled the kingdom dry. The cost of mounting such a massive, prolonged defense emptied the royal treasuries that had been filled by generations of conquest and trade. The grain stores that fed the army and the people were depleted. To pay and supply his troops, Ramesses had to strip resources from the empire's outer provinces. One by one, Egypt's hard-won holdings in Canaan and Syria were abandoned. Their garrison troops pulled back to defend the homeland. The empire simply retracted, like a wounded animal pulling its limbs close to its body. The victory over the Sea Peoples did not strengthen the pharaoh's grip, it shattered it. The immense strain broke the back of the central government. The priesthood of Ammon, grown incredibly wealthy from the spoils of war, began to rival the pharaoh's own power. In the decades that followed, the unified kingdom of the new kingdom fragmented, entering the long, politically confused era known as the Third Intermediate Period. Egypt did not fall to a foreign conqueror, but it collapsed from within, devolving into a collection of smaller, rival states often ruled by Libyan chieftains and powerful high priests. The civilization that had stared down the apocalypse became a shadow of its former self, turning inward and losing its sway over the wider world. Its story is a powerful lesson in resilience, but also in the hidden costs of survival. It endured the storm that shattered its rivals, yet it emerged into a new age forever diminished, a glorious echo living among its own monuments. The vibrant city of Ugarit was the beating heart of international trade, a place where merchants from a dozen kingdoms haggled in the crowded streets. Its archives, filled with clay tablets in a symphony of languages, from Akkadian to Hittite to its own native tongue, tell the story of a truly globalized society. This was a cosmopolitan crossroads, a city plugged into the world, and then, in a single, violent day, it was all over. The archaeological evidence from its ruins is chillingly abrupt. In one home, excavators found the skeleton of a man cut down in his final moments, an enemy soldier's sword still wedged between his ribs. In a potter's workshop, the kiln sat filled with vessels, perfectly shaped and waiting for a firing that would never come. Life was frozen in an instant of pure catastrophe. The city was put to the torch, and unlike many ancient sites, it was never rebuilt. Its name, its memory, and its role as a commercial hub were erased from the earth. This pattern of sudden, terminal violence repeated itself along the entire coast. Great centers like Ashkelon and Ashdod were also reduced to smoking rubble. In the wake of this devastation, a new cultural force moved into the vacuum. These were the Philistines, one of the groups historians identify among the Confederation of Sea Peoples. Their arrival is marked in the archaeological record by a sharp break, the sudden appearance of a completely new material culture, with distinct pottery styles, architectural forms, and dietary habits utterly foreign to the preceding Canaanite world. The old, vibrant network of Canaanite city-states, with their intricate trade links and sophisticated urban life, was extinguished forever. The lights of the coastal cities went out, one by one, plunging this strategically vital corridor into a long and profound darkness. But the crisis was not confined to the mainland. Far out in the shimmering Mediterranean, the island of Cyprus held a secret that powered the entire Bronze Age world. Its ancient name was Alashia, and it was the single most important source of copper, the essential ingredient for bronze. Without Cypriot copper, the great arsenals of the Hittites and the workshops of Mycenaean Greece would have fallen silent. This island was the engine room of an era, a place of immense wealth and strategic importance. Yet this very importance made it a prime target when the world began to unravel. The great Cypriot centers of Inkomi and Kishon were not quiet backwaters. They were bustling, fortified cities, home to skilled metalworkers and international merchants. And then the fire came. Archaeological excavations reveal that these cities suffered violent destruction, their streets littered with the evidence of a fierce fight. We find hastily dug mass graves and hordes of bronze tools and weapons hidden by people who hoped to return for them but never did. Was this the work of the Sea Peoples, drawn to this island of metal like moths to a flame? Or was it an explosion of internal conflict, as different factions fought for control over the last remaining veins of wealth in a disintegrating world? The truth is likely a brutal combination of both. The disruption of the Cypriot copper trade would have been a catastrophic blow to the mainland empires. Think of it as a sudden global energy crisis. A king could raise an army, but without a reliable supply of bronze for swords, shields, and chariot fittings, that army was useless. A palace could promise protection, but without the tools of war, that promise was empty. The collapse of this single, critical supply chain did not just cause economic hardship, it dismantled the very mechanism of military power and royal authority. Cyprus, the great provider, became a vortex of chaos. its fate inextricably linked to the empires it supplied. Its story shows us that the collapse was not a series of isolated events, but a chain reaction of failing connections, where the fall of one critical node could bring down the entire network. The Uluburun Shipwreck lies at the bottom of the Mediterranean, a frozen moment of a world in motion. Discovered off the coast of Turkey, this single vessel was a floating microcosm of the entire Bronze Age system. Its hull was packed with 10 tons of Cypriot copper ingots, stacks of tin, vibrant blue glass from Mesopotamia, ebony and ivory from Africa, and jars filled with terebinth resin and spices. The cargo represented a dozen different cultures, all bound for the palaces and ports of a connected world. This was not an unusual voyage, it was standard practice, the very engine of a sophisticated international economy. Then the voyages stopped. The sea lanes that had been bustling highways became empty, dangerous frontiers. The ship that never reached its destination became a symbol of something far larger, the sudden cardiac arrest of global trade. The routes that carried tin from the distant mines of Afghanistan to the weaponsmiths of Anatolia were severed. The paths that brought amber from the Baltic Sea to the courts of Egypt fell silent. This was not a simple recession, it was a total network failure. The Central Palace economies, which relied on a constant influx of these exotic raw materials, were starved. Kings could no longer acquire the copper and tin needed to cast the bronze swords for their armies, or the gold and ivory to craft the gifts that cemented diplomatic alliances. The entire prestige economy, the system that demonstrated power and fostered loyalty, ground to a halt. With the collapse of commerce, the specialized knowledge of the merchants and diplomats who navigated this complex web became obsolete. The polyglot trader who could speak Hittite, Akkadian, and Mycenaean Greek, the scribe who understood the exchange rates between silver and grain, the sea captain who knew the currents and safe harbors from the Levant to the Aegean, their vital skills were no longer needed. In just a generation, this hard-won intelligence, the software of globalization, was erased. The world did not just become poorer, it became vastly smaller and profoundly simpler. Societies that had looked outward for centuries were forced to turn inward, reverting to isolated, self-sufficient local economies. The vibrant, colorful tapestry of international exchange frayed into separate, dull threads. This disintegration of trade was not merely a symptom of the collapse, it was a primary cause, cutting the lifeblood from the great states and leaving them weak, isolated, and unable to respond to the gathering storm. From the ruins of a globalized world rose a new, harder reality. The old system had relied on a fragile network of trade to supply the essential ingredients for bronze. Now, with those networks shattered and the great palaces in ashes, communities were forced to look inward to find strength in the very ground beneath their feet. They turned to iron. This was not a smooth, planned transition. The first iron objects were often inferior to well-cast bronze, brittle and prone to rust. The knowledge of how to smelt iron ore at temperatures high enough to purify it was a difficult secret to master. Early blacksmiths were more alchemists than artisans, experimenting with furnaces and bellows, learning through trial and error how to carburize the surface of the metal, transforming soft iron into a thin shell of much harder steel. This was a technology born from necessity, a local solution to a global shortage. Why rely on a king to provide tin from a mine 1,000 miles away when the raw material for iron could be found in a local bog or a nearby hillside almost everywhere? This simple fact democratized metal production in a way that was unimaginable in the Bronze Age. A village, a clan, or a rising warlord no longer needed access to an international supply chain to equip a fighting force. They just needed a skilled smith and a source of ore. The very nature of power was changing in the forge's fire. When perfected, a steel-edged iron sword was not just a little better than a bronze one, it was a revolutionary leap. It could hold a sharper edge, was less likely to bend in the heat of battle, and could smash through bronze armor with devastating force. This technological shift did not just change weapons, it began to reshape societies. The old aristocratic elite, whose status was built on controlling the bronze trade, found their monopoly on military power broken. New groups who mastered the difficult art of ironworking could now rise to prominence. The political map of the ancient world was being redrawn, not in palaces but in smoky workshops, one hammer strike at a time. A world that had been defined by its grand palaces and cosmopolitan cities was now gone. In its place, a profound quiet settled over the land. The great palace bureaucracies, with their armies of scribes and specialized artisans, did not just shrink, they vanished entirely. The skills of fresco painting, intricate metalworking, and the very act of writing itself were lost for centuries in many regions. Society did not reorganize from the top down, it rebuilt from the ground up, and the new unit of survival was the village. People clustered together in small, self-sufficient communities, often on defensible hilltops far from the ruined coastal trade centers. Life became local, insular, and overwhelmingly focused on the basics of survival. The ambitious projects of kings were replaced by the daily needs of the clan. Monumental architecture, those massive walls and temples that proclaimed the power of a central state, simply ceased to be built. Why would a community of a few dozen families struggling to grow enough food waste precious labor on a grand palace for a king who no longer existed? Their world had shrunk, and their ambitions had shrunk with it. This great ruralization was not a gentle transition. It was a stark simplification, a forced retreat from the dazzling complexity of the Bronze Age. Archaeological surveys show a dramatic drop in population across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Some areas lost up to 90% of their inhabitants. The reasons are tragically clear: the combined horrors of warfare, famine, and disease that followed the collapse. Many of those who survived abandoned the vulnerable, open plains and their labor-intensive farms for a more mobile, pastoral life. Herding sheep and goats became a safer bet than planting fields of grain that could be burned by raiders or withered by drought. This shift to pastoralism was a strategic adaptation to a more dangerous and unpredictable world. You could move your herds away from trouble, whereas a farmer was tied to his land, a sitting target for any passing band of marauders. The grand globalized system had been replaced by a patchwork of isolated, inward-looking villages, each one focused solely on its own subsistence. Yet to call this period merely a dark age is to miss a crucial part of the story. This simplification, for all its hardship, was also a necessary incubation. The old system, with its rigid hierarchies and fragile dependencies, had collapsed under its own weight. The new, smaller communities were far more resilient. They were not dependent on copper from Cyprus or tin from Afghanistan. They did not need a vast bureaucracy to distribute grain. Their needs were local, and their leadership was direct, often based on kinship and proven ability rather than divine right. It was within these smaller, tougher social structures that the seeds of future classical civilizations were quietly sown. In the rocky hills of Greece, these isolated villages would slowly evolve into the independent city-states, the polis, that would one day give rise to Athens and Sparta. And in the highlands of Canaan, scattered tribal groups began to coalesce into a new identity, a people who would eventually become the Israelites. The great forest of empires had burned away, allowing new and hardier saplings to finally find the sun. The ghost of the lost Bronze Age world may have found its most enduring voice in the epic songs of a blind poet. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were composed in the 8th century BCE, centuries after the great palaces had fallen to ash. Yet these foundational poems resonate with the echoes of a cataclysm. The world Homer describes is one of bronze-clad heroes, of kings like Agamemnon who ruled from Mycenae, a place the epic specifically calls rich in gold. This was not a fictional setting, but a folk memory of the actual wealth and power of the Mycenaean citadels, a reality that had been utterly erased by Homer's own time. The Trojan War itself, if it has any historical core, would have been a late Bronze Age event, a conflict between powerful states with complex international ties, exactly the kind of world that vanished in the collapse. For generations through the long, illiterate Greek Dark Ages, these stories were not written down. They were preserved orally, sung by bards who strummed their lyres in the halls of chieftains. With each retelling, the memories shifted and merged. The precise historical details blurred, but the emotional truth remained. The trauma of a world consumed by fire, the loss of great cities and mighty kings, the perilous journeys across a sea filled with danger, all of these themes were woven into the fabric of the epics. The Odyssey, in particular, reads like a nightmare of the Sea Peoples era, a tale of a hero wandering a treacherous Mediterranean, encountering strange peoples and struggling to return to a home threatened by chaos. These poems are not history books, but they are a powerful form of history. They are the collective memory of a civilization that endured a shattering collapse, preserving the ghost of its lost grandeur in the stories that would define its rebirth. From the smoldering ruins of the old world, the Phoenicians emerged as masters of the new. While inland empires collapsed under the weight of famine and invasion, their coastal cities, places like Tyre and Sidon, became islands of resilience in a sea of chaos. They were the inheritors of the shattered Canaanite world, but they possessed a unique advantage. Their fate was tied not to the land, but to the water. They looked upon the empty, dangerous Mediterranean not as a barrier, but as a highway. With breathtaking audacity, they launched their sleek, nimble ships into the void left by the collapse of the great powers. They were not conquerors seeking territory, but merchants seeking profit. They sailed west, far beyond the old horizons, establishing trading posts on the coasts of North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, and even distant Spain. At these outposts, they traded not in the bulk goods of the old palace economies, but in high-value, portable luxuries, vivid purple dye extracted from sea snails, precious glass, and the legendary cedar wood from the forests of Lebanon. They became the essential middlemen, the distributors of a new, more decentralized age, weaving together the scattered communities of the post-collapse world with threads of commerce. Their greatest legacy, however, was not a trade good but an idea. Sometime around the 9th century BCE, in the bustling port of Byblos, a revolutionary thought took shape. The old writing systems, the complex cuneiform of Mesopotamia, and the intricate hieroglyphs of Egypt required years of training. They were tools of the palace and the temple, designed to record the deeds of kings and the inventories of the state. The Phoenicians, pragmatic traders who needed to keep records and communicate across vast distances, stripped writing down to its bare essentials. They developed a system with just around 24 characters, each representing a single consonant sound. This was the first true alphabet. It was brilliantly simple, efficient, and most importantly, accessible. A merchant could learn it, a sailor could learn it. It was a tool for practical life, not just for royal propaganda. This single innovation would travel with their ships across the known world. The Greeks would eventually adopt it, adding symbols for vowel sounds, and from there it would become the foundation of most modern writing systems, including the one you are hearing right now. The Phoenician story is a powerful testament to adaptation. The collapse of the Bronze Age was an apocalypse for the great centralized powers, but for those nimble enough to navigate the chaos, it was an unprecedented opportunity. They did not rebuild the old system, they built a new one in its place, proving that from the ashes of a fallen world, the seeds of a new and different future can always sprout. While the coastal plains smoldered, a quiet revolution was taking root in the rugged central highlands of Canaan. Here, far from the ruined palaces and trade routes, scattered groups of farmers and pastoralists were slowly coalescing into a new people, the early Israelites. The collapse of the Bronze Age superpowers had created a unique opportunity. With the mighty Canaanite city-states like Hazor and Megiddo lying in ruins, and the overstretched Egyptian empire pulling its troops back to the Nile, a vast political vacuum opened up. Into this void moved these highland communities, free from the heavy tribute and military dominance of the old order. Their archaeological footprint is strikingly distinct. Their settlements were small, unfortified villages perched on hilltops. Their pottery was simple, undecorated, and purely functional. Most telling of all, their homes completely lacked the religious figurines and elaborate pagan iconography so common among their Canaanite and Philistine neighbors. This was a culture defining itself in stark opposition to the world that had just fallen apart. The biblical books of Joshua and Judges tell a dramatic story of conquest and settlement, a divinely led military campaign. While historians see little evidence for a single, unified invasion, these ancient narratives likely preserve a kernel of historical truth, a cultural memory of a long, complex process of social transformation. It was not a blitzkrieg, but a gradual infiltration and consolidation. These tribal groups filled the empty spaces, carving out terraced farms on the difficult hillsides and establishing a new, decentralized way of life. Their identity was forged not in glorious palaces, but in a revolutionary idea, a covenant with a single, universal God who could not be represented by any image. The rise of Israel was one of the most profound and lasting consequences of the Bronze Age collapse. It was a new form of community, born directly from the ashes of the old, proving that even the greatest catastrophes can clear the ground for worlds yet unimagined. The silence that fell over Greece was more than an absence of sound. It was a void where entire ways of life had simply vanished. For nearly 400 years, the land entered a profound period we now call the Greek Dark Ages. The grand palace complexes at Mycenae and Pylos stood empty, their massive walls crumbling under the sun and rain. The intricate knowledge of linear B script, the very tool of the Mycenaean bureaucrats, was utterly forgotten. No one in Greece could read or write. The vibrant art that once depicted charging chariots and leaping octopuses gave way to simple, geometric patterns on clay pots. This was not a step backward. It was a cultural amnesia so complete that the very memory of the palace system was wiped clean. The population plummeted, with some estimates suggesting a drop of as much as 90%. The few who remained huddled in small, scattered villages, their world shrunken to the horizon of their own valley, isolated and focused solely on survival. This was a society stripped down to its barest essentials, a hard reset after the catastrophic failure of a civilization. Yet within this stark simplicity, a profound transformation was quietly taking root. The old Mycenaean order had been rigidly hierarchical, with a wanax or supreme king ruling from his palace and controlling every aspect of the economy and society. That entire structure was now gone. In its absence, without the overwhelming power of a central palace, new forms of community began to organically coalesce. People gathered for protection and mutual aid, often on a defensible hill, an acropolis. These small, self-governing communities were the embryonic form of the polis, the independent city-state that would one day define classical Greece. The trauma of the collapse had, in a brutal but effective way, cleared the ground. It swept away the old divine right monarchies and their stifling bureaucracies. What emerged from the ashes was a new social contract, built from the ground up, where leadership was more local and direct. It was within these fledgling polis that the revolutionary ideas of citizenship, civic duty, and shared governance would slowly begin to ferment. The darkness, for all its hardship, was not an end. It was the necessary, quiet incubation for a world that would one day give us democracy and philosophy, a world utterly unlike the one the Mycenaean kings could ever have imagined. This unraveling took decades, not days. To see the Bronze Age collapse as a single, apocalyptic event is to miss its true, terrifying nature. It was not a sudden meteor strike that wiped out the dinosaurs in an instant. It was a slow-motion chain reaction, a cascade of failures where each crisis amplified the next. Think of it as a row of dominoes, but a domino line that stretched across continents and over generations. The first piece might have been a drought that weakened a kingdom, making it vulnerable to a raid. That raid then disrupted a trade route, which caused a metal shortage in a distant empire, which led to an army mutiny and internal rebellion. This was not one hurricane, but a perfect storm of invasions, famines, earthquakes, and civil wars, all converging over 50 to 100 years. The timeline itself is a mosaic of decay. The great Hittite capital of Hattusa was abandoned around 1200 BCE, yet the bustling port of Ugarit fell a generation later. Mycenaean Greece experienced a rolling series of destructions, with different palace citadels burning at slightly different times. This staggered collapse reveals a crucial truth: different regions succumbed to different combinations of pressures. One area might have been hit hardest by the Mega-Drought, while another was fatally weakened by the severing of its trade routes, and a third was finished off by a major earthquake. And in this chaotic landscape, there were surprising survivors. Far to the east, the Assyrian Empire, protected by its inland position and fierce, disciplined army, did not just endure, it actually expanded its power in the wake of its rivals' disintegration. Its resilience forces us to abandon any simple story of a universal apocalypse. The real lesson lies in understanding this as a complex systems failure. The brilliant, globalized network of the late Bronze Age was a web of incredible strength, but also of profound fragility. When too many threads were cut at once by too many different kinds of stress, the entire web could not hold. The collapse was not an event. It was a process, a long, painful unraveling of a world that had become too connected to withstand a perfect storm. The echoes of that ancient collapse ripple across the centuries into our own living rooms. Our modern world, with its digital networks and just-in-time shipping, is the most complex and interconnected system humanity has ever built, and it shares the same profound vulnerabilities as the Bronze Age palace economies. We too depend on fragile, invisible threads that span the globe. A political crisis in one nation can halt the production of microchips, paralyzing industries on the other side of the planet. A pandemic can freeze the movement of people and goods, revealing how thin the margin is between abundance and shortage. Our own reliance on long and highly specialized supply chains is a source of miraculous efficiency, but also of catastrophic risk, a lesson the merchants of Ugarit learned in the most brutal way possible. The parallels extend to the very climate. The mega-drought that starved the Hittites finds its modern counterpart in the escalating climate disruptions we now face, from rising sea levels threatening coastal megacities to shifting weather patterns that jeopardize the world's breadbaskets. The ancient world was brought down by a convergence of stresses: and we now watch our own potential perfect storm gathering, a mix of environmental, economic, and geopolitical pressures that could push our systems to a breaking point. Yet within this sobering history lies a powerful message of hope. The end of the Bronze Age was not the end of humanity. It was a brutal, painful simplification, but from that simplified landscape arose entirely new forms of society. The old, rigid hierarchies gave way to more resilient, adaptable communities. The vacuum left by fallen empires created space for new ideas to take root, from the Greek city-state to the Israelite covenant. The survivors of that age did not rebuild the old world, they invented a new one. Their story is a testament to human ingenuity and our profound capacity to adapt. It reminds us that collapse, while terrifying, can also be a form of creative destruction, clearing away ossified structures and allowing for revolutionary change. The ultimate lesson is not one of doom, but of perspective. By understanding how a civilization can unravel, we gain the foresight to reinforce its weakest links. We are not passive observers of history, we are its active participants, living in a world that is just as magnificent and just as fragile as the one that was lost to the flames 3,000 years ago. The story of this ancient drought is written not on clay, but in the very growth rings of trees that witnessed it. High in the mountains of Turkey, scientists have studied the preserved wood of ancient juniper trees, some of which were alive during the final century of the Bronze Age. Their trunks tell a clear and alarming story. For years, the rings are wide and robust, indicating seasons of good rainfall and healthy growth. Then, around 1200 BCE, the pattern changes dramatically. The rings become desperately narrow, pressed tightly together in a silent scream of environmental stress. This was not a few bad years. This pattern of stunted growth points to a prolonged, multi-generational drought, a period of such profound aridity that the land itself was gasping for water. This single line of evidence is powerful, but science demands corroboration. Thousands of miles away, in the frozen depths of Greenland's ice sheets, another record was being kept. Researchers drilled deep, extracting long, pristine cores of ancient ice. Each layer is a time capsule of the atmosphere, trapping tiny bubbles of air and fine particles of dust that drifted across the continents. In the layers corresponding to the era of collapse, the concentration of atmospheric dust increases sharply. This dust had to come from somewhere. Its spike strongly suggests that vast regions of the Mediterranean and Near East had become drier and windier, their exposed soils picked up by the wind and carried incredible distances before finally settling on the ice. The Earth itself was becoming a desert, and the proof is frozen in time. A third line of evidence comes from the mud at the bottom of ancient lakes. By extracting sediment cores, scientists can analyze the fossilized pollen grains preserved within. In a healthy, farmed landscape, the sediment is rich with pollen from olive trees and cereal grains like wheat and barley. These were the cash crops of the Bronze Age, the foundation of its wealth. But in the critical period, the pollen record shifts. The pollen from these demanding, water-intensive plants declines drastically, replaced by the hardier pollen of scrub plants and pines. The agricultural heartland was retreating. Farmers could no longer sustain the orchards and fields that fed the cities and paid the taxes that supported the armies. This trio of scientific detective work, using tree rings, ice cores, and pollen, moves us beyond ancient texts and burned cities. It provides physical, chemical, and biological data that is impossible to ignore. The Bronze Age world was not just fighting invaders or economic turmoil, it was struggling against a changing planet. Its agricultural base, the very foundation of any complex society, was collapsing under a relentless, sun-scorched sky. How could any king, no matter how powerful, hope to rule when the rains simply refused to fall? The battlefield of the late Bronze Age was a symphony of clashing bronze. A soldier's sword, his spearhead, even the scales of his armor were all forged from this singular, glorious alloy. But this military dominance came with a staggering price tag. Bronze was not a single metal you could simply dig from the ground. It was an invention, a deliberate recipe requiring two crucial ingredients, copper and tin, which were almost never found in the same place. A king's power was literally measured by his ability to control these distant supply chains, stretching from the copper mines of Cyprus to the tin sources as far away as Afghanistan. This system created a military elite, an aristocracy of war whose status was built on a monopoly of metal. The established empires, like the Hittites and the Mycenaeans, fielded professional armies equipped with beautifully cast bronze weapons, designed for the set peace battles and chariot warfare they had mastered. Then came the Sea Peoples. The Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu depict them not with the standardized gear of a royal army, but with an eclectic and terrifying arsenal. They wielded long, slashing swords, perfect for close-quarters combat on a heaving ship's deck. They are shown throwing javelins, a weapon of harassment and skirmishing, not the ordered ranks of spear-wielding infantry. And some historians suggest that among their number were warriors carrying something new, something darker and more resilient, early iron weapons. This was the true military crisis for the great kingdoms. When a bronze sword shattered in combat, it was a significant economic loss. Replacing it required a functioning international network to deliver new ingots to the royal smiths. As the Sea Peoples severed the sea lanes and raided coastal ports, that network disintegrated. A kingdom could win a battle but lose the war because it could no longer rearm its troops for the next engagement. Their soldiers would be left facing an enemy who seemed to have an endless supply of sharpened metal. The emerging technology of iron, while not yet perfected for mass production, represented a profound shift. Iron ore was not rare, it was everywhere. Any local hillside or peat bog could yield the raw materials. The knowledge of how to smelt it was difficult, a closely guarded secret of itinerant blacksmiths, but it was a knowledge that could not be controlled by a centralized palace. This shifting foundation of warfare was both a symptom of the collapse and a direct cause of its acceleration. The old powers were trapped, trying to defend a world order with a weapon system whose supply chain had been cut. The new forces, whether raiders or rising local chieftains, were embracing a technology that was inherently decentralized and resilient. Control was slipping from the hands of kings and into the forges of those who could master the new fire, forever changing the balance of power in the ancient world. When the gods of empires fall silent, people begin to ask new questions. The great state pantheons, whose priests had promised divine protection for the king and his kingdom, had been proven powerless. The storm god who failed to bring rain, the war god who allowed defeat, the royal patron deity who watched his temple burn, all stood discredited by the scale of the disaster. This spiritual vacuum became a crucible for profound religious change, a desperate search for meaning in the ashes of a world that had been abandoned. In Greece, the old Mycenaean pantheon, centered on figures like the Potnia, the mistress of animals, began a slow metamorphosis. Over the centuries of the Dark Ages, these older divine figures were reshaped, merged, and reimagined into the familiar Olympian gods of classical mythology. Zeus, once perhaps a minor weather deity, ascended to become the king of gods, his authority reflecting a new social order no longer dominated by a single all-powerful palace. This was not an overnight replacement, but a long cultural digestion of trauma, where the old gods were remade to fit a new, more fragmented world. Far to the east, in the highlands of Canaan, an even more radical spiritual revolution was taking root. The early Israelites, forging their identity away from the coastal chaos, developed a form of worship centered on a single God, Yahweh. This was not yet pure monotheism, the belief that only one God exists, but monolatry, the exclusive worship of one God while acknowledging others might exist. Their covenant was a direct response to the collapse. Why serve the many gods of the failed Canaanite city-states or the impotent deities of Egypt? They sought a more portable, more personal divine relationship, one that did not depend on a specific temple or a king's favor, but on a direct pact between their community and their God. This was a faith built for resilience, for a people without a palace, a faith that could survive displacement and hardship. The trauma of the Bronze Age collapse forced humanity to renegotiate its contract with the divine. The old model, where the gods guaranteed the power of the state in exchange for lavish temples and royal patronage, had shattered along with the palaces. In its place arose new understandings of divinity, some more personal, some more universal, all seeking to answer the same haunting question: if the gods we trusted could not save our world, what new power can? The very words they spoke were buried with their cities. Across the fallen empires, the languages of power and administration fell silent. Hittite, the complex tongue of treaties and royal decrees, was never written again. The intricate Mycenaean Greek of the Linear B tablets, which recorded deliveries of olive oil and chariot wheels, was utterly forgotten, its meaning lost for over 3,000 years. Luwian, a language spoken across Anatolia, faded from official use. This was more than a political collapse, it was a cognitive extinction, an erasure of entire libraries of human thought. The clay tablets sat in the fire-hardened ruins, their messages locked away, waiting for modern linguists to become their first readers in millennia. Yet nature abhors a vacuum, and so does human communication. As the old centralized state shattered, new forms of speech and writing rose to fill the silence. In the power vacuum of the Near East, Aramaic began its extraordinary journey. Originally the language of nomadic Aramean tribes, it was perfectly suited for the new, more mobile world. Its simple 22-letter alphabet was far easier to learn than the hundreds of signs required for cuneiform. Aramaic became the language of traders, diplomats, and empires, spreading along the new trade routes that slowly re-knitted the region, eventually becoming the daily speech of common people from Egypt to Persia. This linguistic reshuffling was a direct mirror of the New World Order. The old hieratic scripts, controlled by palace scribes and temple priests, were tools of the elite. The new alphabets were tools of commerce and practicality. The most revolutionary of these was born in the Phoenician ports. Their alphabet was a stroke of genius, a system so streamlined and efficient it could be learned in days, not years. It was a technology for the masses, or at least for the merchant class. When the Greeks encountered this system, they saw its potential and made one crucial improvement. They borrowed the Phoenician letters but designated some to represent vowel sounds, creating the first true alphabet that could precisely capture the nuances of spoken language. This Greek alphabet would later be adopted and adapted by the Romans, and from there it would travel across the world, forming the foundation of the very script you are reading now. The fall of the Bronze Age did not just topple kings and burn palaces. It erased and then rewrote the fundamental code of Western civilization. The silent tongues of Hittite kings were replaced by the versatile letters of Phoenician merchants, a shift in communication that echoes the profound shift in power from inland palaces to coastal entrepreneurs. What other profound transformations were waiting in the shadows of this new, quieter world? A single ship, lost for over 3,000 years, holds the ghost of that entire globalized world in its broken hull. The Uluburun Shipwreck lies 50 meters deep off the coast of southern Turkey, a time capsule preserved in the dark silence of the sea. When archaeologists meticulously excavated the site, they uncovered not just a vessel, but a floating microcosm of the late Bronze Age. Its cargo was a map of international relations made tangible. There were 10 tons of raw copper ingots, shaped like ox hides, mined in Cyprus. There was a full ton of tin, the other essential ingredient for bronze, likely from distant Afghanistan. Stacked in the hold were beautiful Canaanite jars that once held precious resin from the terebinth tree, used for incense and perfume. They found ebony logs from Egypt, elephant tusks from Africa, and vibrant blue glass ingots from Mesopotamia. There was even Baltic amber, which had traveled from the cold northern forests all the way to the warm Mediterranean. This was not a royal ship on a diplomatic mission, but a merchant vessel on a standard commercial run, proving that this level of international exchange was the everyday reality of the age. The sheer diversity of its cargo is breathtaking. It connects dots across the entire known world, from the Baltic Sea to the Nile Valley. Think of the countless hands that touched these goods: the miners, the merchants, the sailors, the scribes. This ship was a single thread in a vast, shimmering web of commerce and culture. Its voyage was a routine calculation of wind, current, and profit, a testament to a system that worked with astonishing efficiency. Yet the Uluburun ship never reached its destination. It sank around the year 1300 BCE, a century before the Great Collapse. Its fate is a quiet, tragic premonition. The intricate network it represents, the very system that gave the Bronze Age its brilliance, was also its greatest vulnerability. When the storm came, it was these vital sea lanes that were the first to be cut. The ships that followed the Uluburun's path would soon stop sailing altogether, and the silence that fell over the Mediterranean would be as deep as the water that entombed this one vessel and its forgotten world. Out of the silence left by fallen giants, new and terrifying forms of power began to stir. The void created by the Hittite disappearance and Egypt's retreat was not left empty for long. It became a stage for ambitious new actors, empires that would shape the next 1,000 years with an iron fist. The first and most fearsome to rise were the Assyrians. Nestled in the heart of Mesopotamia, they had weathered the collapse through a combination of fierce militarism and a fortunate geographic position. While others crumbled, they conserved their strength. And when the dust settled, they looked upon a world ripe for conquest. Their expansion was not like the trading networks of the Bronze Age. It was a machine of pure, calculated terror. They pioneered the concept of total war, deploying disciplined, professional armies equipped with the latest iron weaponry. Their tactics were brutally efficient, combining armored infantry with swift chariots and sophisticated siege engines capable of battering down city walls. When a city resisted, the Assyrians made an example of it. They did not just defeat their enemies, they sought to annihilate their will to ever resist again. Their royal inscriptions boast of flaying rebels alive, of stacking pyramids of skulls outside conquered gates, and of deporting entire populations across their empire to break their connection to the land. This was empire building as psychological warfare, a system designed to rule through sheer, paralyzing fear. Far to the east, in the highlands of Iran, other powers were coalescing in the shadows of the Assyrian colossus. The Medes and the Persians were initially loose confederations of tribes, but contact with and subjugation by their aggressive neighbor forced them to adapt. They learned from Assyrian military and administrative techniques, but they would eventually perfect them into something far more durable and sophisticated. The Persian model of empire, which would reach its zenith under Cyrus the Great, was a revelation. Where the Assyrians ruled through terror, the Persians learned to rule through tolerance and brilliant organization. They divided their vast territories into provinces or satrapies, each governed by a royal appointee but allowed to maintain local customs, languages, and laws. They built a royal road stretching over 1,600 miles, with courier stations that allowed messages to travel from one end of the empire to the other in a matter of days. This was a world away from the palace-centric, tribute-based systems of the Bronze Age. The new empires of the Iron Age were not just larger, they were fundamentally different in their structure and their philosophy of control. They were centralized, bureaucratic, and built for scale. The old, multipolar world of Brother Kings was gone, replaced by a polarized landscape of colossal, land-based superpowers competing for absolute dominance. The Dark Age had ended, but the peace of the interconnected past was a distant memory, replaced by the grim permanence of the imperial frontier. The vibrant, lifelike art of the great palaces died with the kings who commissioned it. Before the collapse, you could walk through a Minoan palace and see frescoes of leaping dolphins and graceful athletes, their movements captured with astonishing fluidity. In an Egyptian temple, the reliefs showed pharaohs and gods in perfect, idealized proportion, a celebration of a stable and divinely ordered world. This was naturalistic art, funded by a wealthy, centralized state and created by generations of master craftsmen who passed down their techniques. Then the palaces burned, the workshops were abandoned, and the sophisticated skills of fresco painting, intricate metal inlay, and detailed stone carving were lost within a single generation. What emerged from the ashes was a completely different visual language. In Greece, the elaborate scenes of Mycenaean pottery, with their swirling octopuses and chariot processions, vanished. They were replaced by the sober, precise patterns of proto-geometric pottery. These were not pictures of the world, but ideas about it: stark bands, concentric circles, and precise zigzags, all drawn with a compass and multiple brushes. This was not a decline in talent, but a profound shift in purpose. Without a wealthy king to glorify, art was no longer about projecting royal power. It became a local craft, something a village potter could produce. The complex, naturalistic art of the Bronze Age required a stable, wealthy society to support it, with specialized artists and a constant supply of expensive pigments and materials. The new geometric art was a product of a smaller, more inward-looking world. Its power lay not in its realism, but in its symbolism. These patterns could be understood and reproduced by an entire community, reinforcing a shared identity in a fractured landscape. Art stopped telling the story of a godlike king and began to express the rhythms and order sought by a community of survivors. The very stones they built with tell a story of a world in retreat. The colossal, cyclopean walls of Mycenae, which once proclaimed the unshakable power of a king, were the last of their kind. In the centuries that followed the collapse, no one attempted such monumental feats of engineering. The ambition itself seemed to have vanished from the earth. Instead, communities gathered on high, defensible hilltops, building their homes with smaller, rougher stones that were easy to handle without a royal architect's direction. These new settlements were not designed to project power over a vast territory, but simply to survive in a more dangerous and fragmented world. The Grand Palace Citadel, with its sprawling storerooms and administrative wings, was replaced by a simple village huddled behind a basic defensive wall. This was not a decline in skill, but a fundamental shift in priorities. The central authority that could command thousands of laborers to move multi-ton blocks was gone. The wealth needed to pay specialist stonemasons and engineers no longer existed. Power had shattered into 1,000 pieces, and each small community was now its own master, focused on its own immediate security. The very shape of a city was remade. The sprawling, open-plan lower towns of the Bronze Age, which thrived on peaceful trade, were abandoned. People retracted to the Acropolis, the high city, turning inward both physically and socially. The landscape of human ambition was literally scaled down from the palace to the village, from the empire to the clan. This new, smaller architecture was a direct and practical response to a world stripped of its old certainties. What new kinds of societies would eventually grow from within these humble, fortified hilltops? The final blow to a civilization rarely comes from a single direction. While empires crumbled under the weight of invasion and earthquake, an even more insidious enemy was spreading through the crowded, weakened cities. Disease and famine, the silent partners of collapse, left a fainter mark on the archaeological record than burned palaces, but their role was just as devastating. Imagine the conditions inside a city like Hattusa during a multi-year drought. The grain stores are empty, the water sources have dwindled to muddy puddles, and the population is crammed together behind the great walls for safety. Malnutrition weakens every immune system. In this environment, a simple illness, perhaps brought by a trader or a soldier from a distant land, can ignite into a catastrophic epidemic. The skeletal remains from this period tell a grim story. Archaeologists find the bones of individuals with telltale signs of chronic stress, such as lines of arrested growth in their teeth, marking periods of childhood sickness or starvation. These are the physical echoes of a society breaking down from the inside out. The written pleas from Hittite officials are even more direct. One tablet begs a neighboring region for a shipment of grain, stating plainly, "There is a severe famine in your land. All of my subjects are dying." This is not just a request for aid, it is a diagnosis of a terminal condition. The memory of such plagues was seared into the cultural consciousness of the survivors. Centuries later, Homer's Iliad, set in the final days of the Bronze Age, opens not with a description of heroes, but with a plague ravaging the Greek camp before the walls of Troy. The god Apollo rains arrows of pestilence upon the army, a poetic explanation for a historical horror that the bards of the Dark Ages could not forget. The combination was fatal. Climate-induced famine did not just starve bodies, it starved armies of soldiers and kings of taxpayers. It broke the spirit of communities, turning ordered societies into desperate, frightened mobs. A population fighting for its next meal cannot also man the walls against a foreign invader. A king who cannot feed his people loses his divine mandate to rule. The plagues and famines were the internal rot that hollowed out the great kingdoms, leaving them as brittle shells, ready to shatter at the first external shock. The story of the Sea Peoples as a faceless horde of destroyers is a myth we have inherited from the victors. For over a century, the narrative was simple. Barbarians from the sea descended upon the civilized world and burned it to the ground. But modern historians now see a far more complex and tragic picture emerging from the ruins. These warriors were likely not the primary cause of the collapse, but rather one of its most visible symptoms. They were almost certainly displaced populations themselves, people pushed from their homes by the same relentless drought, famine, and political unrest that was crippling the great empires. Imagine entire communities, their fields turned to dust and their wells run dry, packing their families onto ships not for plunder but for survival. Their attacks on the coastal cities were not a coordinated war of annihilation, but the desperate actions of refugees fighting for a place to settle. The distinction is crucial. They were not an external, alien force, but a product of the very system that was failing. The frantic letters from Ugarit pleading for help against the enemy ships take on a new, haunting meaning when you consider that the scribe writing them and the warrior attacking him were both victims of the same global catastrophe. This reframes the entire collapse from a simple story of good versus evil into a colossal human tragedy. It was not a war between civilizations, but a systemic failure that pitted desperate people against each other in a fight for dwindling resources. The Sea Peoples did not topple a healthy world. They gave the final, decisive shove to a structure that was already rotten at its foundations, buckling under the weight of its own interconnected fragility. The storm that ended the Bronze Age was not a single thunderclap, but a cascade of failures that fed upon each other. Environmental crisis starved the great kingdoms, economic collapse severed their lifeblood, and military innovation shattered their old ways of war, all while social unrest tore them apart from within. This perfect storm did not just defeat empires, it wiped the slate of the ancient world completely clean. A profound darkness descended, an age of poverty and forgetting where the grand memories of kings and palaces faded into folk tales. Yet this void was not an end. It was a necessary silence, a fallow period that allowed the soil of history to recover. From this chaotic landscape, new and enduring civilizations slowly took root. The isolated villages of Greece would eventually coalesce into the brilliant city-states that gave us philosophy and democracy. The merchant sailors of Phoenicia launched their ships into the empty sea, weaving a new web of trade and gifting the world an alphabet. In the highlands of Canaan, the tribes of Israel forged a revolutionary covenant with a single God. And from the ashes of the old powers, the terrifying military machine of Assyria and the sophisticated imperial model of Persia rose to dominate the next millennium. This cycle of collapse and rebirth teaches us a profound dual lesson. It reveals the terrifying fragility of any complex, interconnected society, where a shock in one area can trigger a total system failure. But it also showcases the incredible resilience of the human spirit, our boundless capacity to adapt, to innovate, and to rebuild from the ruins. History does not move in a straight line, but in a great turning wheel of creation, destruction, and renewal. As we look back across 3,000 years at the ashes of Hattusa and the silent ships of Uluburun, we are left with a haunting and essential question. What does the fate of that once globalized world whisper to our own interconnected age? A world just as magnificent and just as fragile, about the storms that may yet gather on our own horizon.